This national battlefield was first named a cemetery. It is only one of the many ironies that confront the visitor. Named for the loser, not the victor, this remains the only Indian Wars battlefield the general public can name. This, the scene of the greatest white disaster in the West, is the most visited Indian Wars site. Victorious in virtually every other major battle, the white commander will always be remembered for this, his single major defeat. There is irony for the Indian here too. The sight of his overwhelming victory, by its very totality, brought swift and massive retribution, ending, for all time, life as he knew it. White losses were 268 men. Indian losses cannot be accurately determined, but are believed to have been between 40 and 150. Yet, in spite of the fact that these casualties would barely rate classification as a skirmish in the Civil War, this battle is the most written about, most painted, and most famous battle in American history. The battle of the Little Bighorn. The commander, George Armstrong Custer. The place, Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. Once the scene of deadly combat, all races mix proudly here. To the Native American, this is the scene of his last great victory over the white invader. The whites that visit the site are also proud. No cowards died here. An Indian honor guard leads the procession to bury the remains of some 31 troopers, white, who died here. Both honor the dead. This is as it should be. For Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument and its Custer National Cemetery honor all the dead of the Indian Wars. In its grounds, they lie together. Custer National Cemetery is a good place to begin your tour. Pick up the free pamphlet at the entrance and wander through the grounds. In another of its ironies, only 2 officers who fought at this battle are buried here. All others' remains were disinterred and buried at various other sites. Lieutenant J. Crittenden's body never left the battlefield. His parents requested he be buried where he fell. He remained there until the present road was built and his remains were moved from the battlefield to the National Cemetery. The only other officer buried here is Brevet Brigadier General Marcus A. Reno, surely the most controversial officer to survive the battle. His remains were brought back here in 1967, when an Army board reversed an earlier courts-martial sentence and thus opened the way for the second highest ranking officer at the battle to rest here. Custer's remains lie at West Point. Walking through the cemetery, you will find familiar names from other Indian Wars engagements. Fetterman, Brown, and warriors White Man Runs Him and Curley, both scouts with Custer. The honored dead here include many other Indian War sites, such as Fort C.F. Smith in Montana and Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming. The stone house, built in 1894, once housed the cemetery superintendent. It has seen various uses in recent years: interpretation, housing, and as a meeting place. The cemetery has been the scene of many impressive ceremonies and holds countless memories.
It was on this date, approximately this time, and in this place, that battle was fought.
In 1940, the War Department turned over the battlefield to national parks. In the early 1950s, National Parks constructed the museum you see here. It's a good place to begin your battlefield tour. If you are here during the summer, you should first find out about the schedule of interpretive talks. They are an excellent introduction to the events that transpired here. Though constantly changing, talks are given on topics such as Indian culture and life.
They would honor him, stating that nobody is to ride Comanche. He'll be shown as the last survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. They placed a McClellan saddle up on his back.
The bands of the Lakota Nation down there, they call themselves the Teton Lakota. All 7 bands that comprised the Teton Lakota were present that day.
To load the weapon,
Soldier equipment and
simply
regimen,
draw a cartridge, slip it inside, and pick
and
the
of
target
course,
at
the
anywhere
battle
from
itself.
200 to 350
Your
yards.
visit will be more
Inside that
meaningful if you
showing
can
range.
first listen
Now
to these
draw upon
excellent
your target
presentations.
And fire.
Is that visitor center?
The museum strives always to bring meaning to what happened at this site. Here are displayed items from the period, as well as the battle. A set of buckskins owned by George Armstrong Custer.
Is also carried in the sacred symbol. They taught those things.
Period uniforms. Weapons used by both sides are displayed, along with other items of use to both soldiers and warriors engaged in the battle. Some cases display soldier life. Others depict Indian regalia. There are excellent dioramas. Take your time, and you'll be rewarded by a better understanding of both races. Perhaps now is the time to take a bus ride. The bus tours take you off of the battlefield itself and down into the valley of the Little Bighorn. The modern buses are air-conditioned, and the drivers are knowledgeable. The tour gives the visitor a view of the site of the Indian encampment, the Reno skirmish line, and adds much perspective to the fight in the valley. Don't miss a bus tour. Buses tend to sell out early, so don't be disappointed. The tour takes about an hour.
79, 3 years after the battle, is open to veterans of all wars. It was closed in 1977 to new graves. There's some 5,000 headstones in this cemetery. This battlefield here consists of about 600 acres, and it is completely surrounded by the Crow Reservation. To the south and east of us, about 4 miles, is a battlefield of the Reno Benteen battlefield. It's about 160 acres, which I'll be able to point out to you from down on the campsite. We will go down on the river, the valley floor, and I'll show you where the Indians were camped the day of the battle. 15 to 20,000 horses up there. This camp, on the Indian part of it, they estimated some 10 to 12,000 Indians, which 2,500 or 3,000 of those would be warriors.
Proceeding down the valley of the Little Bighorn, you will learn the details of the campaign as you drive through to the area of the Indian village. On both sides of the road, you'll see the modern homes housing descendants of the scouts for Custer. This is the Crow Reservation. The vantage point on the benchlands across from the Reno Benteen defensive site is your first stop. Drivers describe and point out the action.
The firing line. The rest of them simply retreated on back into that brush and timber. Now, Reno said the ground was growing Indians. He said there were more of them coming back at him all the time. And the Indians simply circled on around back on the other side of these hills, and they'll be back up here in these hills just over the top of the van, and from there firing shots down into Reno's position, and Reno's taking casualties from just about this time onward. Looking around, still wondering where's Custer. And Custer will be seen over in those far hills and right up in the skyline. He supposedly rode up there, he took off his hat and he waved it at the men down on the valley floor, and then he turned around and said to his own men, he says, "Hurrah, we've got them all now, boys, we caught them napping." And it's from up there they send Giovanni Martini back with the note.
Across the valley, in the area of Reno's retreat, are 3 stone markers. One marker is for the famous scout, Charlie Reynolds. One is for the 7th Cavalry's part Indian officer, Lieutenant McIntosh. And the newest marker for the only black man with the 7th, the interpreter Isaiah Dorman. All were killed during Reno's retreat to the bluffs. On the way back to the museum, you will stop in the area of the Indian village. In your mind's eye, imagine the scene on this beautiful valley that afternoon in 1876. This was one of the largest gatherings of Native Americans ever seen. It is easy to see why the Indians chose this spot. A short ride brings you back to the museum.
The warriors did not need to
With all this preparation, you're now ready to begin your tour of the battlefield's mysteries. Don't start here at Last Stand Hill. Drive the 4 miles of paved road to the Reno-Benteen Defense Site. The battle unfolds from there. All signs are designed to be read on the return from the Reno-Benteen Site. Standing in the parking lot of the Reno-Benteen Defense Site, look to the east to see the Wolf Mountains. This marks the divide over which Custer and the 7th Cavalry began their approach to the Indian village. Separating his regiment into 3 columns and a strongly reinforced company to protect the pack train, the 7th Cavalry came down the watershed of Reno Creek there in the distance. First to see the action would be Major Marcus A. Reno, the regiment's second in command. He was ordered to take 3 companies, A, G, and M, totaling some 140 men, plus the Arikara scouts, to pursue some apparently fleeing warriors. Reno was told he would be supported by the whole outfit. Reno's command crossed the Little Bighorn River and began a movement down the valley you see here.
Open column. Open column. Open column.
Instead of running, it soon became obvious that the Indians were swarming out to meet him. Not far from the Gary Owen post office site, Reno threw out a skirmish line and sent messengers back to inform Custer that the Indians were in great strength and were not fleeing. Receiving neither word nor support from Custer, and finding himself being outflanked, Reno soon wheeled on his right and brought his pitifully small contingent into the woods near the Little Bighorn River. Reno stayed in these woods less than 30 minutes. Running low on ammunition and closely pressed, he decided to retreat back across the river toward support. Dashing out of the woods, Reno's 3 companies rushed along this line of timber. Indian pressure on his right forced Reno's troopers to cross the Little Bighorn at a steep, narrow ford, possibly a buffalo crossing. The retreat cost Reno 33 men killed and 16 missing, left in the woods without getting the word to retreat. Most of these men would make it back miraculously. Mysteriously, the Indians did not cross the river and press Reno's disorganized command. Custer's promised support had at last come, and the Indians now abandoned the attack on Reno to face this new threat on their village. Captain Frederick Benteen, with his 3 companies, H, D, and K, joined Reno's badly shaken command on the site now known as the Reno-Benteen Defense Site. Benteen had been ordered to probe the south to be sure there were no villages missed. By the time Benteen had returned to the trail, he had already received 2 messengers from Custer telling him to bring up the pack train on the trail behind him and come quick. Benteen stopped to give aid to the badly shaken men of Reno's command. A short time later, the pack train joined up with the now united commands of Reno and Benteen. A short foray was made to Weir Point, the highest spot on the battlefield. The view failed to show anything more than large numbers of Indians, though firing was plainly heard. As Indian warriors came forward toward the command, a decision was reached to defend the original site, now called Reno-Benteen. The retreat was orderly, but 1 wounded man was left to the Indians. His marker is seen by the roadside. The remnants of the regiment, not knowing what became of Custer, now gave thought to defense. The regiment had no entrenchment tools, so shallow pits were dug with forks, spoons, and drinking cups. An orientation map sets the scene for the visitor. A pamphlet is available to use or for 25 cents to keep. Listen to the recorded message, and then, using the pamphlet, begin your tour of the Reno-Benteen defensive position. This point, furthest north, gives a good view of the crossing site of Reno's harassed command. Over there, on that hillside, are the markers for Dr. J.M. DeWolf and his orderly. They chose the wrong hill to climb and were separated from the rest of the command and killed. The steep bluffs made this a defensible position, but not one without its weaknesses. A major weakness was the hill seen here. Most Indians were poor shots, but at least one Indian shot well enough to give this particular ridge the name Sharpshooter Ridge. Particularly vulnerable were the animals, all formed in a semicircle in this area. Imagine for a moment several hundred horses and mules in this small depression. In its center, Dr. Henry R. Porter, the one remaining surgeon, set up his hospital, using the livestock as cover for the wounded. The whinnying and braying of frightened animals, added to the screams of wounded men, must have produced a scene of indescribable horror. Wounded and dying horses, mules, and men, all crying for water. Water was probably the most serious problem faced by the command. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the temperature climbed into the high 90s. The position was certainly defensible, but the need for water would defeat them if the hostiles couldn't. Lieutenant Edward L. Godfrey recalled,
"The excitement and the heat made our thirst almost maddening. Some tried to eat hard bread, but after chewing it a while, would blow it out of their mouths like so much flour."
By the morning of the 26th, the command had been without water for almost 24 hours. Dr. Porter advised Major Reno that some of the wounded would soon die unless given water. Captain Benteen called for volunteers to take kettles and canteens to the river for water. 4 men went to the edge of the river bluff, seen here, and stood up, firing their carbines to distract the Indians on the other side of the river. As these men drew fire, others rushed to the river and filled containers. Miraculously, only 1 man was wounded in the fort. 19 Medals of Honor were given for this act of extreme bravery. This point is called Medal of Honor Point. Restored rifle pits, really mere indentations in the hard ground, are found at points 4, 5, and 7. These pits were later used to bury 2 or 3 men after the fight. Uncovered in the June 1958 restoration of the rifle pits were skeletal remains, buttons, and bits of uniform cloth. The remains are likely those of Julian Jones and Thomas Medder, killed on the firing line. Medal of Honor winner Charles Windolph remembered,
"When the firing commenced in the morning, I said to Jones, 'Let's get our coats off.' He didn't move. I reached down and turned him over. He was dead, shot through the heart."
A party of warriors crawled up the ravines leading from the river to this point during the night of June 25th. The morning of the 26th, the Indians were close enough to throw rocks at the soldiers. Captain Benteen led a charge and drove the warriors back. 1 soldier was killed in this action. Marker 12 is placed at the spot of a makeshift barricade. This is a low spot, and many horses and mules were killed here. The remains of 1 soldier, unknown, were discovered here. 13 and 14 are restored rifle pits. Imagine lying in these shallow depressions with bullets everywhere, with the cries of the wounded, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the merciless sun beating down on you. Passing more rifle pits brings us to marker 17, the site of the grave pit of at least 1 7th Cavalryman. These remains were probably disinterred in 1881 and placed in the mass grave around the memorial shaft on Custer Ridge. This look at the Reno-Benteen defense site is now complete. The remnants of the 7th Cavalry tenaciously defended this position against Indian pressure for both the 25th and the 26th. They continued to look for help. Where was Custer? It's now time for us to follow, as closely as possible, Custer's route to Monument Hill and immortality. Leaving the parking lot, going toward the museum, the road parallels Custer's route for almost a mile. On your left is a turnout that gives an excellent view of the Reno Retreat crossing. Look to the left and you'll see the markers for Dr. J.M. DeWolf and his orderly. On one of these high points in the valley, soldiers saw Custer. The exact point is in dispute, along with many other details from this point on. To your right is Cedar Coulee, appropriately named. It is believed that Custer led his 5 companies, C, E, F, I, and L, down this ravine, possibly to conceal their presence from the village. At the base of Weir Point, Cedar Coulee takes a sharp turn away from the village and ends at the foot of Weir Point, in Medicine Tail Coulee. It was from this junction of Medicine Tail Coulee and Cedar Coulee that Custer sent his last message to Benteen. The climb to Weir Point is not difficult, and the view is rewarding. Looking north, you can clearly see the trees around the museum. Action on Last Stand Hill would have been easily seen by those on this hilltop, especially through field glasses. Looking back to the south, the Reno-Benteen defense site is about 1 3/4 miles away. Weir Point was clearly a commanding position, but lack of access to water and the very openness of the terrain made it impossible to defend with the number of troops in Reno's command. Medicine Tail Coulee gave Custer the best access to the Indian village. Many scholars believe Custer sent 2 companies down Medicine Tail to threaten the village and relieve the pressure on Major Reno. Custer himself, with 3 companies, cut across Medicine Tail, always looking to his rear in the hopes of seeing Benteen and the pack train. As you descend the bluffs from Weir Point to the broad, flat expanse of Medicine Tail Coulee, look to your right. Here in the relatively unbroken ground, the 2 companies approached the best river crossing, then and now. Here you are in Medicine Tail Coulee, looking back east. The cavalry came from this direction, seeking the ford here. It is probable that no attack on the village was contemplated by this 2-company battalion. They were to merely draw the Indians from Reno, buying time for Custer. The plan was an overwhelming success. In great force, the Indians crossed at Medicine Tail Ford and forced the pitifully small contingent back in the direction of the road you are on, parallel to the river. In the very middle of the coulee, on your right, is a marker, the Sergeant Butler marker. Though there are numerous theories, no one is certain why Sergeant Butler's body was discovered high up there on the ridge all alone. The marker is a 1/4 mile walk up the trail. Remember, this is private land. Shortly past the Butler marker, you re-enter National Park land. A rear guard action was fought near here to slow the tide of Indian warriors. The 2 companies retreated roughly along the line of the road you're on. Tombstones on both sides of the road attest to the action as the troops retreated to effect a junction with Custer's 3 companies. Each marker denotes the spot a 7th Cavalryman fell. No bodies lie under these markers. All have been removed to the mass grave under the granite shaft on Last Stand Hill. The pull-out to your right brings you near the spot where it is believed Custer's 3 companies reunited with the 2 companies that feinted the attack at Medicine Tail Ford. More markers indicate the pressure became very heavy here. Perhaps these men were a rear guard, we don't know. As you drive on toward Last Stand Hill, look to the right. The large number of white markers in the valley attest to the heavy action fought here. Captain Miles W. Keogh died here with a large number of his men from I Company, often called the Wild Eye. Keogh was one of the most flamboyant of Custer's officers and a personal favorite of Custer's. More markers dot the hillsides on both sides of the ridge. The line of silent white sentinels can be followed right to Last Stand Hill. On the left is the only marker to the Indians that fell here, the small wooden sign for Lame White Man. Legislation has been introduced in Congress to establish a monument honoring all the Indian dead at the battlefield. At last, we arrive at Last Stand Hill. Marked by this stone monument, Last Stand Hill is the focal point of the battlefield. The memorial shaft, placed on the site in 1881, is 11.5 feet high and weighs nearly 20 tons. On its sides are inscribed the names of the fallen officers, enlisted men, civilians, and scouts killed here. The list is not entirely accurate. 2 names were omitted, and a re-scout who survived the fight appears in the place of one who lost his life. A trench was dug around the base for a distance of 10 feet, and the remains of all the bodies still on the field were reinterred in this mass grave. Only Lieutenant Crittenden was left where he fell. This area was probably the last pocket of organized resistance. Here, soldiers shot their horses and lay down behind them for the only protection available. George Armstrong Custer died here, though it is possible he was wounded earlier in the action. Dying with him was his brother, Captain Thomas Custer. Nearby, another brother, young Boston Custer, fell. Some believe this area was the hospital. Others believe it was the command post. Hospital, command post, or merely the last frantic defensive position, Last Stand Hill is now the most famous piece of real estate from the Indian Wars. Down the hill, south toward the river, leads Deep Ravine Trail. More fighting took place there, but we cannot be certain if it was before or after the fight on Last Stand Hill. Markers dot the landscape in no set pattern, but all lead to Deep Ravine. There may yet be 28 unrecovered bodies there, but recent archaeological probings failed to uncover evidence of their existence. The hillside on the south end of the cemetery, one can catch a glimpse of the area. Whether the Deep Ravine action was before or after the fight on Last Stand Hill, we don't know. The outcome, however, is known. George Armstrong Custer and every man under his immediate command died. These white markers, so widely scattered over this countryside, almost haphazardly, give mute testimony to the scope of the Indian victory. Was it Two Moon Cheyenne warriors who overran Custer? Or was it Crazy Horses Sioux sweeping around from the other side of the cemetery that administered the final blow? As with so much about this battle, we don't know. We do know that Sitting Bull's vision, a great victory over the whites, had come true. Here, on Last Stand Hill, at Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument.